Welcome to this course on full stack application development with React and Spring Boot. I am Rangarao Karanam. I have more than 20 years of application development experience with a variety of languages like Java, Python, JavaScript, a variety of frameworks, REST API frameworks like Spring Boot, and also front-end frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. In 28 minutes, we ask ourselves one question every day. How do we create more amazing course experiences? The success we have had on a variety of platforms, including Udemy, with more than 200,000 learners, is a result of this pursuit of excellence. We love programming and we think full stack application development is one of the most important skills for a Java developer today. In this awesome course with more than 100 steps, we will build a complete to-do management application step by step, connecting a React front end to a Spring Boot backend, Spring Boot RESTful API. We focus extensively on React during this course. You learn the basics of React components and also understand what is JSX, what is state, and why are props important. We will also look at a number of features related to React. How do you route from one component to another component? How do you implement forms and validations? How do you invoke backend REST API from the front end? We'll use Spring Security to secure our RESTful API, and we would use two different approaches. One is called Basic Auth, and the other one is JWT or JWT, JSON Web Token. We expect you to know the basics of Java programming, a bit of JavaScript programming experience, and a little bit of experience working with the Spring framework would be great. We would help you install all the tools that you'd need for this course. The complete source code and step-by-step details of what we would be doing during this course are available on the GitHub repository of the course. What are you waiting for? Let's have some fun developing a full stack web application with React and Spring Boot. We had a lot of fun creating this course, and we are sure you would have a lot of fun too. If you want to learn more, go ahead and click the enroll button, or you can take a test drive using the free preview feature. Good luck, and I'll see you in the course. Welcome back. In this step, we will want to help you get quickly started with the course. The first thing I would want to do is to congratulate you on making a great choice. Now, let's get down to getting started with the course. The first thing you would need to do is to bookmark the GitHub repository of the course. You'll find a link to it in the resources section of the video you're watching right now. You just have to hover over to the left top corner of the screen and you should see resources and a link to the repository. Just click it, launch the GitHub repository, and bookmark the URL. The repository contains links to all the installation guides we use, step-by-step details of the course, and also the source code. Also present is the source code at various intervals of the course. For example, let's pick up one of these files from here. You'd see that this complete backup is present as one single file. This acts as a reference if you face a problem during this course. If you're having a problem with the map method and you're unable to work out the syntax, all that you need to do is to go to one of the backups and find out how it's done. You just need to search for todos.map and you'll be able to find how it should be done. The first sections of the course focus extensively on React. The tools that you would need for that section are NPM and Visual Studio Code. If you go to the home page of the GitHub repository and search for installation guides, you'd see a playlist which will help you to install Node.js and Visual Studio Code. This playlist contains 3 steps: installing Node.js and NPM, a quick introduction to NPM, as well as installing Visual Studio Code. You can install Java, Eclipse, and the embedded Maven in Eclipse when we get to the Spring Boot section of the course a little later. For now, we would recommend that you would pause the video in here and install Node.js and Visual Studio Code. You can use this playlist, watch it, and install those 2 tools. If you have successfully installed the Node.js and Visual Studio Code, you're ready to rock the React world. If you are a Java developer looking at front-end code for the first time, the first few steps can be overwhelming. You'll be using a new language, you'll be using a new IDE, Visual Studio Code, and you'll be using a new framework, React. And we'll be using something called Create React App, which is a new tool. The first few steps contain a little bit of theory to introduce you to the various parts of developing modern JavaScript applications. Once you get to the second section of the course, you will be spending 95% of the time getting your hands dirty. The recommended approach to follow the course is to take the steps one at a time. Do them in the order they are present in the course. We'll talk about the remaining sections of the course when we get to them. Let's get started with understanding the application architecture in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. I'm excited to help you learn full stack application development with React and Spring Boot, and I'm sure you are as excited as I am. In this step, let's discuss the high-level architecture of the application we are going to build in this course. Let's start with understanding the basic functionality of the application that we are going to build. We are going to build a to-do management application. Everybody has things that they want to do, they want to learn. You want to learn how to develop a full stack application with React. You can manage all of them in this to-do management application. You can add a to-do, you can delete a to-do, and also update a to-do as well. Other than that, we'll also have the authentication features, typically the login and logout capabilities. Let's now shift our attention towards the architecture of the application that we are going to develop. What we are going to develop is a full stack application. When we talk about a full stack application, we are talking about a front-end application which is talking to a back-end API or a REST web service. We are going to use React to build the front-end part. React is a front-end view framework and it makes it easy to develop front-end applications. We would be using modern JavaScript. If you're not familiar with modern JavaScript, that's not a problem at all. We would make sure that you are sufficiently introduced to the modern JavaScript concepts before we would use them in the course. To build the RESTful API or RESTful services in the backend, we'll be using Spring Boot framework. We'll be using Java as the programming language. Spring Boot is the #1 Java framework to build RESTful APIs and microservices. We'll create multiple RESTful services for authentication as well as to-do management. As far as authentication is concerned, we will start with basic authentication and also discuss about how you can use JWTs or JSON Web Tokens for authentication. We will use the Spring Security Framework to build authentication around all the API that we are going to build. Before we move on to the next step, let's discuss an important question. We are talking about building full stack applications. Why should you really build a full stack application? Why should you create a separate backend, a separate front end? There's a lot of complexity associated with this. You need multiple languages, you need multiple frameworks like Spring Boot, React. You need to learn all of that. Why should you really do that? The answer to that question is that you don't want to create a flexible architecture, an architecture which can be extended to meet your future needs. Let's imagine you'd want to develop a native mobile application in future, let's say an iPhone app or an Android application. Maybe you'd want to connect your application to Internet of Things devices, IoT devices. In such kind of situations, we can reuse the exposed backend API. The full stack application with a separate backend API or the RESTful API will give us more options to extend our architecture and create different applications for different devices. In this quick step, we looked at the architecture of the application that we are going to create. We'll create a React front-end app talking to a RESTful backend API built on top of Spring Boot. We also discussed why we build full stack applications. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the first few steps of this course, for almost an hour and a half, we would be focusing on the React application. We would want to understand the basic concepts of React. Most importantly, how do you build components with React? In this step, let's start with creating a simple React application.
How do you create a React application? Create React app. If you do a Google for create React app, you'd land up on the create React app homepage. This is a GitHub repository, and you'd see that create React app is used to set up a modern web application by running one command. Basically, what it helps us to do is to create a simple React application just by running one simple command. What is that command? Just scroll down a little, and here it is. So if you execute a command which is similar to this, create React app would create the basic setup of a React application. Actually, it would create an application which is good enough to take to production as is. To be able to use the create React app, we would need node and npm. Let's launch up our terminal or command prompt. If you are on Mac, it's terminal. If you are on any other operating system like Windows, for example, you have to launch up the command prompt. Just type in terminal and you'd be able to launch up the terminal window. If you're on Windows, you might want to launch up the command prompt in this way. Press Ctrl Escape, launch up the start menu, type in CMD, click the command prompt, and it would open up for you. Now, once your terminal or command prompt is opened, all that you need to do is type in node -version. So important to note, there are two hyphens in here, right? So it's node -version. So once you have a version which is greater than 10, that's cool. You can also type in npm-version to find out which npm version you have. If either node doesn't work for you or the npm doesn't work for you, make sure that you check the installation guide, which we looked at earlier in the course. The command we need to execute to create the React app is npx create -react-app and the name of your applications. So the way we can do that is npx create React app space the name of the application. The name of the application I would want to use is to do app. But before that, what we would need to do? We need to move to the folder where we would want to create this particular application, right? So let's cd to the folder where you'd want to create that application. I'd want to create it in this folder, so I'm doing a cd to in 28 minutes git full stack with React and Spring Boot frontend, and over here I can execute the npx command. Npx create React app space to do app. Once you execute this command, you'd see that this would take a little bit of time because this would create the project and also build it. So the project is created, now it's trying to build it. It's trying to install a few dependencies, React, React DOM, and React scripts, and also their transitive dependencies. So all the things that React DOM needs to work, all the things that React needs to work, and all the things that React scripts need to work. If you have a problem at this stage, and if you are not seeing a project being built like this, or if you get a permissions error, then one of the things you can do is you can try and launch up the command prompt as an administrator. So over here, once you press Ctrl Escape, launch up the command prompt and open up command prompt. Over here, if you right click on the command prompt, you can do a run as administrator. If you are on Mac or Linux, you can try sudo. So instead of trying npx create React app to do app, you can try doing sudo space npx create React app to do app. The other useful thing to do is to Google for create React app troubleshooting. This would take you to a GitHub page, which facebook.github.io. So once you click that, you can see a few other things you can try. Now you'd see that the installation is going on right now. It might take a few minutes, especially if you're running it for the first time. And after the whole thing is done, you'd see that it lists the different commands that you can run. The great thing is now the entire application is set up. So if you open up that specific folder, so if I do present working directory, this is the folder where the project is created. So if I go to the front end, there is a to do app folder where all the content is created. The entire project is created in this specific folder. There are a number of commands which the create React app enables. You can do npm test to run the unit tests which are present in the project. You can do npm run build to create a production deployable. Whenever we write JavaScript code in modern JavaScript applications, we would create hundreds of JavaScript files, and it's not efficient in production to have hundreds of JavaScript files. So what npm run build does is it merges everything into a compressed set of JavaScript files which you can then use for production. All these features are actually built into the application which is created by using the Create React app. The thing which we'd want to do now is to launch up the application. Let's do that right now. So the way you can launch up the application is by saying npm start. So it's the command which is present in here, npm start. So when you press npm start, oops, there's an error. It says I cannot find a package.json file. Okay, cool. Let me check the present working directory and the ls or dir in Windows. You'd see that I am still in the front end folder. To be able to run the npm start command, I would need to cd into the to do app folder. So let's do a cd into the to do app folder, and now let's go ahead and run npm start, and this would kick off the launch of the project. So you can see that the project starts up and launches it in the browser as well. This might take a little while. The page is still loading, and you'd see that it's showing the URLs on the console. So if you want to launch it in Chrome, you can take this URL and launch it in Chrome. Most probably it would have been automatically launched up in your default browser, but if it has not launched up in your default browser, then you can take this URL and execute it, preferably in Chrome, because that's the browser we would be using for the most part in this course. Congratulations! In this step, we created a React application. All that we needed to do was to execute a command npx, create React app, and give the name of the application. The application was created, and after that, we just needed to do npm start to launch that application up. And we were able to see the application in the browser. Right now, we don't really understand what's happening in the background, and that's what we would be looking at in the subsequent steps. Until the next step, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we launched up our first React app in the browser. Isn't that cool? Let's take a step further in this particular step. Let's try and make a small change to this React app and see how to get that change rendered in the browser. What we'll do is we will use Visual Studio Code as the IDE, and let's now launch the application in Visual Studio Code. During the installation guide section of this course, you would have already installed Visual Studio Code. When you launch up Visual Studio Code, this is what you would see. You'd see that we have actually worked on a number of projects recently to make sure that this course is perfect. The other things that you would see in here are help and the learn stuff. I would recommend you to spend some time with the learn stuff to familiarize yourself with the Visual Studio Code IDE. There are a lot of things that you can customize with this IDE as well. Now, we would want to open up our project in Visual Studio Code. There are two ways you can do that. One is open folder. So once you click open folder, you can navigate to the folder where your project is and you can open it. The other option is drag and drop. So I've created to do app in this specific folder. I can drag it and directly drop it in here. Once you drop the folder in there, Visual Studio Code would open up that particular project. You can see the different folders from that specific project and other files which are present in there as well. Now, let's pick up one of these files, package.json. Let's not worry about what the content of this file is for now. Now, I would want to see this in full screen. How can I do that? The way you can do that is by toggling the Explorer bar or by using a Control B or a Command B. This is very important because whenever you are working on a file, you would want to actually work in full screen mode, and that's the reason why we wanted to cover it up as the first thing that we teach as part of our IDE. Control B or Command B is the shortcut to actually maximize this window. The other thing you can do is also to toggle the Explorer bar. So whatever you are seeing in here is called the Explorer bar, where you can actually navigate through all the files, folders, and everything related to your project. There are a lot of other features which are present in Visual Studio Code. You can search for a file. You can look at your source control. I mean, if we actually put it in a Git repository or something, you can actually check which files are committed, which are not, all that stuff in source control in here. You can debug, as well as there are a number of extensions you can add on top of Visual Studio Code. You can check all that stuff on the left hand side bar which is present in here. For now, let's not worry about all of them. Let's focus on actually learning React. Now that we have the application open up in the IDE, let's make a couple of changes. I'll open up the source folder and the public folder. The public folder has something called index.html, which is actually the page which is loaded up when we type in localhost 3000 in the browser. This index.html contains a title element. You can see that the title is React app in here. Let's make a small change. Let's call this to do application, or even further, you can call this my to do application. You'd see that the change is immediately reflected on the browser, right? So the title comes from index.html. That's what we understood right now. The app.js is where all the rest of the content of the page is coming from. So inside the source, there's a file called app.js, and this contains all the stuff you are seeing in here. So you can see that there's a logo which is being put, and it says edit source app.js on save to reload. So what I'll do is now I'll remove all this content which is present in here. Let's remove the header which is present in here, and let's save it. Let's see if the change reflects. Yep, the change reflects immediately. Now to make it easy, I'll say my hello world and save it. Now you'd see that the change is reflected in the browser. Now what's the magic that is happening? How is that the change in index.html is getting reflected, app.js is getting reflected? All that magic is happening because of the create React app. When we build the application with create React app and we start it using npm start, automatically it would keep scanning your code for changes. So as soon as a code change happens, it is automatically built and it is rendered to the browser. In this step, we imported the project into our IDE, Visual Studio Code, and we also made a couple of modifications to it and saw that they were immediately rendered in the browser. In the next step, we would start looking at the individual folders and the different files which are present in here. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In this step, let's explore the folder structure of the project that we have created. There are a number of folders and there are a number of files which are present in here. What are they and where are they used? Let's start with the most important file of everything, which is the package.json. If you are a Java developer, you'd be familiar with pom.xml, the Maven pom.xml, right? That's where you specify the dependencies of a Java project. The package.json is exactly the same file for the JavaScript projects. Here you specify the dependencies you would need to run a project. The interesting thing about React is that React can be used to develop both web applications as well as native applications. For developing web applications, we use React DOM. And for developing native applications, there is another framework called React Native. So the core of the React framework is the same for both browser-based and native applications, and that's what is present in this dependency. And React DOM helps us to run the React framework and view it in a browser. React scripts are basically the ones which provide all the features. When we said npm start, all the work was done by React scripts. Once you specify the dependencies in package.json, npm installs them for you and it uses the folder node modules. If you are coming from the Java world, you can kind of think of the node modules similar to the local Maven repository or even as the target folder where you have all the jars present. So whatever dependencies that we have specified in here and the transitive dependencies of them are downloaded into the node modules folder by npm. The README file contains a little bit of documentation about this project. What are the commands that we can execute and where you can find more information and all the other stuff. Now, let's get to the two other important folders which are present in here, public and source. Public, the most important file is index.html. The index.html is the file which is launched up when we type in localhost :3000 into the browser. When you do a right click view page source, whatever you see is actually the content of index.html in addition with a little bit of bundling on top of all the code which is present in the source folder. The source folder contains all the React code. So all the code that we would write as part of this course, whenever we are talking about JavaScript and React, will be written into the source folder. All this code will be bundled as single file or a couple of JavaScript files, and we would use them along with index.html to run our application. All this work is being done in the background for us. We'll talk about it a little later. But for now, the important thing to understand is source contains all the JavaScript code that we would be writing for React, and index.html is the one which is launched up into the browser. If you look at the source in depth, there are app files, so app.css, app.js, app.test.js. These are the files which are related to app component. These contain the code for the app component, the styling for the app component, and the unit tests for the app component. For Java developers, it might be interesting that we are actually having the unit tests right beside the source code. And that's how typically it's done in the front-end world. In front-end world, we don't really have separate folders for unit tests and production code. The unit tests live right alongside your production code. That's something we might take time getting used to. The two other important files which are present in here are index.css and index.js. The styling which is present in app.css is only specific to the app component. The index.css, on the other hand, is for the entire application. So all the generic CSS that we would want to include, we would include it in index.css. Now, index.js and index.html are the most important files to focus on right now. If you look at index.html, it defines a div with an ID of root. What happens is in index.js is where we say get this element, get the root element which is present in the HTML and render the React application in it. Which component should be rendered in it? Render the app component. The syntax might look a little new for you. Do not worry about it. The most important thing to understand is what's happening. What is happening in here is this div with an ID called root. What happens? This div would be populated with the content from the app component. Who does this? This is the utility method which helps us to do that. React DOM.render. If all the imports and stuff looks very complex for you, do not worry. This is all part of modern JavaScript which we'll get familiar in the next few steps. But the important thing to understand is the fact that in the root div, we are populating the app component using the React DOM API. And that work is done from index.js. If you go ahead and change something, let's say I say root 1 in here. Let's close this. You'd see that it says target container is not a DOM element. It says there is no DOM element called root 1. Let's go to app.js or actually index.html and change this to root 1 and save it. It continues working. Let's go back to root and root in here and save both the files. In this quick video, the idea was to give you a 10,000 feet overview of the different folders, different files, what's their importance, and things like that. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In the previous step, we saw that the index.js is trying to render the app component into the root element. Now, what does this app component contain? What is a component? Why do you create components in React? Let's look at that in this specific step. Typically, web applications are complex, right? This web application has a header, a footer, a page. Here it is to do. It might be welcome page, login page, logout page, or you might even have a menu and other stuff which are present inside the web application. And when we want to develop web applications, we would want to develop them in a modularized way. And that's where components come in. Components help us to design and develop each of these individual elements as an independent, reusable piece. What we can do is we can create a menu component, we can create a header component, we can create a footer component, and we can create a to-do component as well. Component basically allows us to split the UI into independent, reusable pieces of code. When it comes to React, the root component is typically called the app component, and that's what we were looking at in here earlier. So inside the source you have the app.js, which is kind of the root component, because this is the first one which we are loading into the root element. Whenever we talk about a component, there are a number of things that are part of it. The first thing is the view. Over here we are saying this is how the div should be structured. We said we should have text called my hello world inside. So this is basically the view information which we are specifying inside the component, and here we are using something called JSX. JSX is an extension of JavaScript. So what we are doing is, in a JavaScript file we are including something which looks like a HTML, and this is what is called JSX. Instead of JSX, you can also write JavaScript code to do exactly the same thing. So inside a component we have a view which can either be written using JSX or JavaScript. We will have logic. A component might have buttons, might have input boxes, check boxes, a lot of form elements and stuff like that. So what should happen when you change something, when you click a button, all that stuff forms part of the logic of the component, which is typically written using JavaScript. Along with any component, you will also have the styling for the component. All that goes into the component.css file. Which color should something be shown? What size? Should it be center aligned? And all that fun stuff. The other two important things about a component are something called state and props. We'll talk about this extensively when we develop our next examples. We'll develop a counter example and also to-do application, and we will see how state and props play a very important role as part of your component. So until now, we learned that a React application is built as a group of components. Each of these components is independent and reusable on its own. The other thing which we have learned is each of these components contain a view, a little bit of JavaScript logic, styling, and also a couple of things called state and properties. In the subsequent steps, we would start playing with each one of these. Until the next step, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we got a 10,000 feet overview of what is a component. In this step, let's get our hands dirty. Let's play with components. Let's create a new component, and let's talk about something called a class component. What we are doing in here in the app.js is extending a React class called component. You can see that it's imported from React. So to create a component, one of the options is to extend something called component and implement a render method. Let's remove the extends component and let's see what happens. Save. My to-do application has an error. It says cannot call a class as a function. It says there's a type error because it does not extend component. Let's rename the render method render1. Does it work? Nope. It says instance.render is not a function. There is no function called render in the app component. How do I show it? Right? So whenever we create a component, extending the component class, we need to define the render method in it. Let's now create a simple new component, right? So let's create I'm copy pasting the app component and calling this first component. So first component extends component, and I'll call in here first component, and the class name I'll also say first component. I'm saving this and going to the browser. Oops, where is my first component? Is it shown here? Nope, the first component is not being shown. Why is the first component not being shown? Because I have not asked the app to show it. So app is the root. Anything that you would want to show, you need to include in the app component. And the way you can include the first component is by saying first component slash. So this is basically a node first component, and I'm closing it right here. You can also define it in this way, slash first component. So both of these ways would work enough. You'd see my hello world first component being shown in here. What we are creating in here by extending a component is called a class component. So it's called a class component. We'll look at something called function component a little later in the next step, and look at a high level difference between the class component and the function component. But the most important thing for now to focus on is to create a component and display it. All that you need to do is extend component, implement the render method, and include the component as part of the root component. The syntax which we are using in here is called JSX. We would look at JSX in depth very soon. Now, you can try an exercise. You can pause the video in here and create a new component called the second component and include it in the hello world example. How do you do that? So I would want to see a second component right beneath. How can I do that? Okay, I hope you had got a chance to do it. It's very simple, right? So class second component, and this would be second, and even this would be second. Will this show up? Will this show up? Nope. For it to show up, what we need to do is we would need to include the second component in the JSX of the root component. Let's do that. Will it come up now? Yep. My hello world, first component, second component. In this quick step, we looked at how we can create components, how we can create class components. We extend a React class called component, we define the render method, we return the JSX which needs to be shown, and that's it. It gets rendered on the page. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we created a couple of class components, first component and the second component. One of the things in React is that you can also create something called function components. In this step, let's try and understand what a function component is. Now, let's say I would want to build up a third component. How would we do that? To just get introduced to the concept of components and stuff, we are creating all the components in the same app file. Typically, we would actually create separate JavaScript files for each of these. But for now, let's keep it simple and directly create them in the app. At a later point in this course, we'll actually move them out to separate files. So I'll say class third component, extends component, third component, and third component, right? This is basically repetitive stuff, right? There is nothing new that we are doing in here. This is exactly what we were doing in the previous step. So this is how you do a class component. So now I say third component and quickly load up the page. Okay, I see the third component in here. That's cool. So we have a third component, but we want to create a function component. So we want to create third component as a function component. The way we can do that is by simply saying function third component. So the name of the function is third component, and open up the close brace and open brace, and inside that you can say return whatever you are returning from the render class. So as simple as this, return this specific thing back. Now I'll remove the class component which we created for third component, and now when you refresh the thing, you'd see that the third component would work as well. So you can see that creating a function component is much more simpler than a class component. In a class component, you have to extend something, create a specific method. However, when we create a function component, all that you need to do is define a function with a specific name and do a return of it. That's all. What we'll do in this course is wherever we are creating simple components, we'll try and use function components. Class components have a few additional features on top of the function components. One of them is something called state. We'll talk about state a little later, but until then, what we'll do is we'll try and keep using function components to keep things simple. I would recommend you to try creating a fourth component as a functional component and include it in the display of the page. In this quick video, we looked at what is a function component. We saw that defining a function component was much simpler than a class component. Welcome back. In the previous steps, we use a little bit of use of JSX. We learned that you can return the JSX from a component and that is displayed as the view. And we wrote a few simple components where we wrote simple JSX. In this step, let's try and understand JSX a little more. We know that we are including JSX in a JavaScript file, right? So this is a JavaScript file where I'm actually writing some kind of HTML, which we are calling it as JSX, extension of JavaScript. So how does this code get converted to JavaScript code? Isn't that a good question to ask? The thing is, with the create React app comes bundled something called Babel. It's Babel. So if you do a Google search for Babel.js, so Babel.js, this is the thing which converts our JSX code into JavaScript code. Actually, the purpose of Babel is much bigger. Different browsers have different kind of support for all the JavaScript new features. So as a programmer, it is very difficult for me to write code which works on all the browsers. What I can do is I can write code using the latest JavaScript standard and use Babel to compile it to lower versions of JavaScript. That's what Babel enables us to do. It enables us to write code in the latest version of JavaScript and compile it or convert it to earlier versions of JavaScript. So if a browser does not support the latest version of JavaScript, we can use the earlier version of JavaScript to run the code in there. You can go here and click the try it out link. What we want to try now is try and write a little bit of JSX code. So what I'll do is I'll try and write h1 heading and /h1. Let's see what would happen. You can see it's getting converted into JavaScript code. What is happening in here is a method called React create element in the React API is getting called. The first attribute which is passed in h1 is actually the name of the node. The second attribute is actually the attribute. So if I say h1 class name is equal to something, let's not really worry about what it is, then you can see that an object with all the attributes. So this is basically a JavaScript object which is present in curly braces. The first parameter is the name of the element. The second parameter is the attributes, an object with all the attributes which are defined in here. Let's say I had another attribute is equal to, you'd see that that also is passed in as part of this specific object. And the last one is the child element. So what are the child elements which are present in there? Let's create a little bit more complex structure. So let's say there is a parent component and a closing tag for the parent component, and inside that let's say there is a child component, and let's close the child component out in here. Let's say there is some text in the child component. You can see how the JavaScript code for that is, right? So the entire child component is the third parameter which is passed in here. So React.create element parent component, comma, I don't have any attributes. If I have any attributes defined in here, let's say parent attribute is equal to 1 or something. It does not really matter what it is. So then it's passing the second one as the object, and then you can see that the third one is the element, the entire child element which is passed in here. So instead of test, let's say there is another child element in here. What would happen? Another child element slash another child. Oops. What would happen? You can see that the entire this particular element becomes the third attribute to the create element for parent component. For the create element for the child component, the third parameter is create element including the another component thing. So basically what we are looking at is how your JSX gets converted into JavaScript code. I would recommend you to play around with this. Now, let's look at a few tips and tricks regarding JSX. One of the important things about JSX is, let's remove this and let's include h1 some heading slash h1, and let's say I'm including another h2 slash h2. What happens? You can see that it's giving me an error. It's saying adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in a enclosing tag. You can only have one parent element. You cannot return two elements together. If you want to return two elements, you have to create a parent element around them. So I have to do something like this. So div slash div, oops, let me get the syntax right, and then I can actually use this. So this is number one. You cannot return two elements from a single JSX. JSX is like an expression. You can only just return one thing. In later versions of React, you can also use empty node. So I'm removing the div within the nodes. So this is kind of open node, empty open node. This is empty close node. And you can see that this would still work. So this creates something called a React fragment. And within that, you can have two child elements. The other important thing about JSX is the fact that all nodes should be closed. So even though HTML allows you to have something like this BR, right? So this is, if you look at this, this is valid HTML and this is also valid HTML, but this is not valid JSX. In JSX, all nodes should be closed. So if I say A, and inside that, let's say I have a node B, I cannot close A first. It would give you an error. It should be properly closed as well. So in JSX, all the nodes should be properly closed. Now let's switch back to our app component. One of the things you would have observed in here is I'm returning it inside parenthesis. If you remove the parenthesis, let's just quickly remove the parenthesis and try and save it. You can see that there is an error. Cannot actually do something like this. If you want to return a JSX expression from a method, you should start the JSX expression right on that specific line. This would work. You can see that it works, but you cannot do this. So you cannot have an empty line and then define the JSX expression. And that's the reason why we put a parenthesis around the return value. This would help us to have a well-structured code. So this parenthesis in here is very, very important. Without that, the code will not compile. So now you'd see that everything is fine. The next important thing is that for custom defined components, you have to use a capital letter as the starting letter. So let's see this. So I'm saying third component, and I'm changing the third component also to small. What would happen? Let's save this. Oops, third component is not at all displayed. And if you do a right click view source, oops, actually I should have done right click inspect and go to console. The tag third component is unrecognized in this browser. If you meant it to render a React component, it says start with a capital letter, start with an uppercase letter. So you cannot do that. So you have to have a capital letter as the starting name of a custom component. Whether it's a class component or a function component, the name of the component should start with a capital letter. All the small letters are reserved for all the stuff which comes from HTML. We have h1, h2, div, a lot of things that are present in HTML, and all of them are what will use the small letters. The last important thing that we would want to understand is that whenever you use JSX, you need to have React in the imports. If you look at this specific class, we are not making use of React at all. So if you say search for React, this import is not at all used at all. Let's try and remove this import in, and let's see what would happen. Oops, it says React must be in scope when using JSX, right? So you have to import React in if you would want to make use of JSX in your component. So make sure that you are importing React in whenever you are using JSX. In this quick video, We started with looking at Babel JS, which is the one which converts our JSX into JavaScript. JavaScript is what finally runs on the browser. So Babel enables us to write JSX and it converts it into JavaScript. We learned the fact that all tags must be closed in JSX. We also looked at the fact that we cannot return two tags. If you want to return two tags, you have to enclose them in a parent tag, or you can create an empty fragment as we looked at earlier. We saw that if you have complex structure to be returned as part of your JSX, it's better to include it as part of the parenthesis. We saw that a custom component should always start with a capital letter. And we saw that React should always be in scope when we are using JSX. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye. Welcome back. Welcome to this last step of this specific section. In this section, we were focusing on introducing components to you. We created a number of components. The first component, second component, and third component. We also created a couple of class components. The first component was a class component. Second component was a class component. This one was a function component. We saw that the function component was simpler to create. We included all the components that we have created inside the app component by using JSX. In React terminology, app is the parent component, first component is child component. Same is the case with second and third components. So app is typically called the parent component, the first component will be called the child component. One of the best practices that is typically followed in React is that each component is defined in its own file. In JavaScript terminology, each component is defined in its own module. One of the most important thing that a lot of Java developers who come into JavaScript struggle with is the fact that in JavaScript, any JavaScript file is called a module. So this app.js is now a module, and these are all the classes which are present inside that particular module. If I create a new file called firstcomponent.js and put this specific class in it, then that would become a module and it would contain the class first component. Let's start doing that in this specific step. So now I would want to take this component and move it to its own folder. So typically the folder structure which we would use would be in source. I would right click and create a new folder. So all the components would go into this specific folder. So in source we created a folder called components, and inside components I would want to create a new folder and call this as learning examples. We will later create a folder for counter, because counter is one of the examples that we would create. We'll also create a folder for to do. So we'll store all the counter components in one folder. We'll store all the to do components in another folder. Now what we want to do is we would want to create this component in a file. So what I would need to do is now right click. I would need to create a new file. I'll name this file as first component dot JSX. Typically any component which contains JSX can be defined with an extension first component.jsx. So let's use first component.jsx as the name, and I'm going to, oops, I've copied the wrong thing. Let's go to the app.jsx, do a cut and paste in here. Let's save both the files. Will the code succeed? Let's see what error comes in. It says first component is not defined. App.js is saying first component is not defined. I have no idea where this first component is. What do we need to do? We would need to import it in. So if you are using a class from a different module, what do you need to do? You need to first import that specific thing in. So I would now need to say import first component from, where is that file? Dot slash components slash learning examples slash first component. Oops, it says attempted import error. I'm trying to import this in, but it does not contain a default import. So it's saying first component does not contain a default export. Once you define a module, if you want something from this module to be available to other modules, you need to export it. The way you can export it is by saying export default. So this is the thing which you need to export by default, and do this. Let's see what would happen. When you look at this, it says now there are two errors. It says component is not defined, React must be in scope and using JSX, right? So we would need to import those stuff in. I'll go to the app.js and copy this stuff in. So what we are doing is we are importing React and the component from React. So now you would see that the application loads fine. One of the questions that you might be having is, why is it like this? Why is it, I'm saying React and component in braces? Why does it not work when you do this? It gives you an error. Why? Let's look at it right now. I'll open up the app.js. For a moment, let's say I would want to take the second component and put it in here. So I'm taking second component and putting it in the first component. Even here, this can be exported. So I can export any number of classes from a single module. So this module is exporting two classes. So now app.js wants to use the second component also. What would happen if I put second component as import here? Will it work? Nope. However, if I put it in braces and wait for a while and go, oops, it works. What's happening in here? You can see that the first component is the default export. So the default export alone, you can directly use it. For all other exports which you have from that specific class, you need to put them within curly braces. React is the default export from the React package. Component is exported, but it's not really the default. So if you want to use component, you need to put it within curly braces. In this step, we were playing around with modules. What we did is we took the first component and we created a new folder structure for the first component. What we did is we created source components, learning examples, first component, and we exported this and we imported the created module in the app.js. We saw that to import, we needed to add an import statement, import the component name from the path to the module. We saw that there were a couple of imports missing in the component itself. So we added the imports in, and after that we had to export default the first component so that we could get the first component working. And after that, we did a simple example of moving the second export to understand why curly braces are needed. Curly braces are not needed for default exports, but for all other stuff which is exported from a module, you would need curly braces. Now, I'll recommend you to do an exercise where you would actually move the second component and also the third component to their own modules. So what you need to do is create third component.jsx and the second component.jsx and move the second and the third components to those files. Do that as an exercise, and I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye bye.